Brett Wexler divorced Joanna on a Tuesday evening, with the settlement papers already tabbed, the attorney already seated, and a bottle of champagne already chilling in the kitchen. Joanna Fairchild Wexler, 36, wife of Brett Wexler, 39, founder and chief executive of Nextbridge Capital Advisors, had just walked through their front door from the hospital, her father's hospital. The coat across her shoulders smelled of antiseptic and parking garage cold. She had not eaten since morning. She had been holding her father's hand when the monitors changed, and the floor nurse had asked her gently to wait in the hallway. She had wanted to come home and tell Brett. A foolish part of her, even now, had hoped he would see her face and simply ask. Instead, she walked into the dining room and found the table covered in legal folders. Brett sat at the head in the charcoal suit he wore whenever he needed people to believe he was larger than he felt. Beside him was Mitchell Grange, 51, a divorce attorney with careful eyes and the practiced stillness of a man who had stopped being surprised by rooms like this years ago. Helen Wexler, 62, Brett's mother, and the woman who had spent 4 years calling Joanna dear, the way other people said nothing, sat near the sideboard in a pale silk blouse as though she had dressed for a ceremony. And beside the window, positioned just close enough to the curtain to appear incidental, stood Cleo Strand, 33, head of brand strategy at Nextbridge Capital and Brett's secret for the past 8 months. Cleo wore a thin gold bracelet on her left wrist. It was a delicate thing, almost unremarkable. Joanna recognized it because she had given it to Brett the year Nextbridge cleared its first real revenue. He had worn it for a month, then said he had lost it. Brett looked at Joanna across the room and said, "I need this done tonight." Joanna looked at the papers, then at Cleo, then back at the man who had once kissed her fingers in a rented stairwell and told her she was the only person alive who made him believe he could actually do this. Is she the reason? Before Brett could answer, Helen folded her hands on the table. Cleo isn't the reason, she said. Cleo is what became available when Brett finally accepted that he had moved past where you two stopped. Joanna waited for Brett to correct that. He didn't. That silence reached somewhere the papers couldn't. Is that what you believe? Joanna asked him. Brett looked at the table. I think we've been over for a long time, he said. I'm tired of pretending otherwise. So she stood and watched him sign. Page after page, the pen moving with the deliberate calm of a man who had already made his peace with the cost. Mitchell had quietly suggested that Brett review the disclosure attached to Joanna's separate family trust interest before waiving further inquiry. Brett had waved the suggestion away the same way he waved away anything that slowed him down. He wanted the clean version of his future, and he wanted it tonight. When the last page was signed, Helen walked to the kitchen doorway and said something to someone waiting inside. Joanna removed her wedding ring and set it on the table beside the papers, near enough to the pen that the two things almost touched. She did not say what she wanted to say. She only looked at Brett one more time, and then she walked out. Outside, the night air was thin and cold. Her phone lit up before she reached the car. Her father was gone. 4 years earlier, the conference room smelled of cheap carpet and the specific kind of anxiety that settles into a room when something is about to go badly wrong. Joanna had not planned to be there. She had planned to meet Brett for dinner after the meeting. Maybe walk home if the evening stayed warm. But Brett had called 40 minutes before his pitch, his voice cracked in a way she had not heard since early in their relationship, when his first job offer fell through and he had sat in his car for 2 hours before coming inside. He said only 3 words, "The laptop's dead." She had taken a cab. When she arrived at the rented conference room on the 7th floor of a mid-rise in Midtown, Brett was standing over a dead screen with the expression of a man watching his future drain out through the floor. The investor panel was expected in 20 minutes. The pitch deck, the financial model, the projected revenue charts, all of it locked inside a machine that would not turn on. Joanna did not panic. She looked at the printed backup beside the laptop. She had told Brett to bring a hard copy that morning. He had said it was unnecessary. She asked Kaya, 23, the building's front desk manager, who had been working since 6 and had the particular exhausted alertness of someone too young to show it, whether there was a working computer she could borrow. There was. It was slow, but it worked. Joanna rebuilt the slides from memory. She had read the deck enough times in the previous 3 weeks that she could close her eyes and see the column headers. But when she reached the revenue projection slide, she stopped. The recurring revenue figure was wrong. Not wrong by accident, wrong in the way fear made numbers grow, inflated by hope, dressed up by exhaustion. The real figure was defensible. The number on the slide was not. She changed it. Brett, reading over her shoulder, went rigid. That makes us look smaller. It makes you look honest, Joanna said. There's a difference. His jaw tightened. She recognized the expression. He used it when someone was right, and he did not want to be grateful for it. Investors don't fund careful, he said. She stopped typing and looked at him. Then don't try to impress them. Make them believe you know exactly where the problems are, and that you're the one who can fix them. He had no answer. He rarely did in those years when she was right. Before the investors arrived, she walked him to the stairwell. He was shaking, not visibly, his jaw was set and his shoulders were squared, but she had been close enough to Brett long enough to know the tells. The way his palm pressed flat against the wall, the way he breathed in without fully releasing it. She reached up and straightened his collar. You are about to walk in there with the truth, she said. That's rarer than anything you could put on a slide. He looked at her. Why do you believe in me like this? She almost told him everything then. Almost said, because I chose you out of every easier thing I could have had. Because I left behind a name that opened every door in this city, and I chose to stand here in a rented stairwell with you. Instead, she smiled and gave him the answer he needed. Because I know who you are before the room does. The pitch went better than it had any right to. Brett answered the hard questions honestly. He named the risks before they could be accused of hiding them. He spoke about what needed fixing. He sounded like a man prepared to be examined rather than one desperate to be believed. At the end, one of the investors leaned back and said, most founders try to sell us certainty. You seem prepared to be examined. That is uncommon. After the investors left with promises of follow-up, Brett found Joanna near the hallway window and pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than it needed to. He held her face in both hands and said, when this works, everyone is going to know you were standing here with me. She believed it. She believed him for a long time after that. Amos Park, 27, finance associate at Nexbridge Capital Advisors and the youngest person on the professional staff by 4 years, had been there that day. He had been there for most of the days that mattered. He had watched Joanna work through financials in the corner office while Brett argued with early clients in the room next door. He had watched her catch a billing classification error before a mid-year audit that would have cost the company a client relationship they could not afford to lose. He had watched her stay until 10 o'clock on a Friday when Brett was traveling because the payroll system had glitched and someone needed to make sure the numbers balanced before Monday. And he had never forgotten, not once in 2 years, the morning she had told him quietly that she had covered a payroll shortfall from her own savings and that Brett should not know. He's working so hard, she had said. This one shouldn't be another thing he carries. Amos had kept that for 2 years. He had told himself it would matter someday that he knew. The night of the divorce, he had been there because Brett needed a finance witness for the company separation clauses in the settlement. There was a provision confirming that Joanna was waiving any claim to Nexbridge equity she had never formally held. Amos had signed as a witness in under 3 minutes and spent the remaining time near the back of the room, watching. He watched Helen sit up straighter when the champagne was poured. He watched Cleo touch the wall beside the window with 2 fingers. Proprietary. The way you touched a surface you were already deciding what to do with. He watched Mitchell say something low to Brett about the family trust disclosure and watched Brett tell him to move on. When Joanna left, Amos was the only person in the room who followed her with his eyes all the way to the door. The Aldrin Capital Summit was held in March, at a hotel in the financial district that had not yet fully decided whether it wanted to feel established or ambitious, and had settled uncomfortably somewhere between both. Brett arrived with Cleo beside him and his new communications director 1 step behind. He wore a lighter suit than usual, something deliberate chosen for the room. He had been refining his infrastructure investment pitch for 6 weeks. Nexbridge needed capital badly. 3 institutional clients had restructured their contracts over the winter, and the gap in the balance sheet had become too visible to manage quietly. Aldrin Capital was the firm that could fix it. Every serious founder in the room wanted a seat at their table. Brett had not read the keynote roster carefully. He was not in the habit of reading names that did not directly concern him. The lights in the hall dimmed. A voice at the front said, "Please welcome the chairwoman of Crestline Holdings and controlling principal of the Aldrin Capital Group, Ms. Joanna Fairchild Aldrin." Brett heard the name and did not immediately understand it. Then she walked onto the stage. Not Joanna Fairchild Wexler. Not the quiet woman who had rebuilt his investor deck on a borrowed computer and held him upright in a rented stairwell. Joanna Fairchild Aldrin, 36, newly recognized principal of a $17 billion infrastructure and logistics conglomerate that managed freight corridor networks serving nearly a third of the institutional client base in the Mid-Atlantic corridor, including 3 of Nexbridge's largest remaining clients. Brett stopped breathing somewhere between her name and her face. Cleo beside him went very still. Across the room, Amos found a seat near the press section and looked down at the summit program in his hands. He had not told Brett he was coming. He had not been certain until this moment that what he had done 2 weeks ago with a secure upload form and a personal laptop was the right thing. He was certain now. Joanna did not look at Brett when she stepped to the podium. That was the part that stayed with him longest. Not the revelation, not the inheritance, not the private knowledge that he had signed divorce papers while she was standing hours away from inheriting an empire. It was that she had not come to that stage to find him. She stepped to the microphone and let the room settle around her the way someone lets a door close behind them, without drama, without hurry. She spoke about stewardship, about what capital required of the people who held it. She said that her father had built Crestline on a belief that the purpose of a stable institution was not to grow past its integrity, but to protect the people who depended on it to remain honest. Around Brett, investors nodded. Beside him, Cleo's fingers uncurled from the armrest. It was such a small movement. He noticed it the way you notice a door closing in another room, the sound reaching you only after it has already happened. Brett requested a meeting through official channels. His attorney contacted Joanna's office. A 30-minute window was arranged in a side conference room 1 floor below the main hall. He entered without his tie fully straightened. Joanna sat across the table with Ingrid Howe, 44, a trust litigation attorney who had known the Aldrin family for 11 years at her right. Brett looked at Joanna and said what she had known he would say from the moment she walked out onto that stage. "Why didn't you tell me?" Joanna looked at him, not with cruelty. That was the thing he hadn't prepared for. There was no anger in it. Only the calm of someone who had long since stopped waiting for anything in particular. "Tell you what, Brett?" His mouth opened, closed. He tried again. "Who you were, what your family was." "You knew who I was," she said. "You just didn't think it was worth asking about." He flinched. "My father warned me," she continued. "He said that if the right man knew what my last name opened, I would never be certain whether he loved me or the access I came with. So I used my mother's name. I built a life as Joanna Fairchild. I wanted to be chosen without the doors. I wanted to be enough on my own." She paused and her voice did not waver. "And I was for a while." Brett looked down at the table. "If I had known." "That's why I didn't tell you," she said quietly. "Because if $17 billion would have changed your decision, then signing those papers was the most honest thing you've done in years." The room held that for a moment. Brett reached into his jacket and removed the summit program. His thumb pressed over her printed name, Joanna Fairchild Aldrin. "I thought Cleo understood the rooms I needed to be in," he said. Joanna glanced once at Ingrid, then back at him. "Cleo taught you how to look like you belonged," she said. "I was trying to teach you how not to lose yourself once you got there. Those aren't the same thing." Brett's eyes were red at the edges. "I'm sorry," he said. She believed that he meant it. It wasn't enough, and she was done pretending that meaning something was the same as it being sufficient. "I hope you become someone better after this," she said. And because the door was still open, and she had nothing left to shield him from, "just not beside me." The morning after her father's death, Joanna had sat in the study of the Aldrin estate, while Wallace Ivers, 58, Crestline's general counsel and the man who had served Arthur Aldrin for 22 years, laid out the succession documents on the desk without ceremony. Crestline Holdings, $17 billion in enterprise value, freight corridors, medical supply contracts, private logistics agreements that moved more goods through the eastern seaboard in a quarter than most companies managed in a year, and through the Aldrin Capital Group, a position of quiet institutional influence over the exact category of mid-market financial advisory firm that Nexbridge had been trying to reach for 3 years. Joanna had sat in the chair beside the desk, not the chair behind it, not yet. Wallace had set a small wooden box on the desk between the folders. Inside was her father's old fountain pen, plain and heavy, with a hairline crack near the barrel where it had been dropped years ago and carefully repaired, and a letter folded in thirds. Her father's handwriting was still strong, the hand of a man who had spent a lifetime signing things that mattered. "Joanna, I was proud of you every day, including the days you didn't call, but loyalty without self-respect becomes a beautiful cage. If the man you chose has honored you, share this life with him. If he has not, and I suspect by the time you read this, you will already know the answer. Do not use what I built to buy back a seat beside someone who removed your chair. Use it to hold the door open for the people who never had one. That was always the point of any of this. She read it twice, then folded it and held it against her chest. Nextbridge appeared on the Aldrin Capital Review slate 2 weeks after the summit. Brett had submitted materials through the standard portal. The package was clean-looking. Careful language, confident projections, a pitch video with good lighting, and a rehearsed calm that sounded almost like the real thing. Amos had submitted a separate document, not to Brett, to the Aldrin Capital Review office. A quiet upload through the secure investor inquiry system at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night from his personal laptop at his kitchen table. He had included the original payroll records from the month Joanna had covered the shortfall without telling anyone. He had included the pitch deck version history from 4 years ago. The metadata that showed the file had been rebuilt from scratch in under 2 hours on a borrowed machine at the front desk of a rented conference center. And he had written a short note. You should know what she did that no one thanked her for. It was not revenge. He had thought about it for weeks before he did it and had decided that was not the right word. The right word was record. He needed there to be a record. Joanna recused herself from the final vote on Nextbridge. She told the review committee that her personal history with the company's founder made her ineligible to evaluate its merits in either direction, and that the process had to be clean. She asked that the same governance standards be applied to every company in the cycle. Verified revenue projections, independent conflict review, executive certification of all vendor relationships. No exceptions, no carve-outs, no quiet accommodations. The committee found 3 issues in Nextbridge's materials. Revenue projections that counted unsigned client renewals as near certain income, a vendor contract with unusually high billings, and an undisclosed personal relationship with the founder, and an internal warning from 8 months prior that had been read and never answered. Brett received the committee's decision the same way every other founder did, through the formal process, through official correspondence, without any personal contact from Joanna. That was what she had promised, and she kept it. 3 months after the summit, Nextbridge's board removed Brett from the chief executive position. The company survived, restructured, with new leadership and a compliance framework that should have been in place years earlier. The employees kept their jobs. The useful parts of what Brett had built, the relationships, the technology, the early institutional goodwill, were preserved under people who understood that those things had always been more valuable than Brett's image of himself. Clio's consulting firm lost 4 clients in the weeks after the governance review became public. She was not indicted. She simply found that the rooms she had spent years working to enter had quietly adjusted their guest lists. Amos stayed on through the restructuring. He helped rebuild the finance division from the ground up, with oversight, with clean books, with the kind of careful methodology that Joanna had always been trying to show Brett was possible without making a performance of it. Months after the summit, Joanna stood before a room of former Nextbridge employees who had been absorbed into Crestline's advisory services division as part of the restructuring arrangement. They applauded when she walked in. Not the polished applause of conferences where everyone watched everyone else. This was the sound of relief. People who had spent months not knowing whether they would still have health insurance, still have a reason to set their alarms. She signed the Worker Protection Initiative with her father's pen. Afterward, a young woman from the compliance team, Calla Way, 24, 3 months into her first job out of graduate school, approached her near the coffee station and asked carefully how she took her coffee. Joanna paused. For 4 years, she had known exactly how Brett took his. 2 sugars, a little cream, always too hot. She had made it without being asked. She had made it so many times that the motion was automatic, thoughtless, the kind of small act that becomes invisible precisely because it is never acknowledged. No one had thought to ask about hers. She smiled. Black, she said, just black. Outside the building's windows, afternoon light fell across the glass towers of the Aldrin Capital District. The skyline her father had 40 years quietly shaping, without anyone needing to know his name. And Joanna Fairchild Aldrin walked toward the rest of it, not because the grief was finished, not because the loss had stopped being real, but because the life that waited ahead of her had never needed anyone's regret to justify its beginning. Some people only understand what they were holding after their hands are already empty.